Okay, so first off, so after watching it more than once, quite often like this for some of the grosser parts, at least I know where they are now, so I'm not, yeah. Um, how does like your movie address the concept of blood quantum? Because I know we've talked about this before that like a lot of non-indigenous peoples don't even know what blood quantum is, despite having invented it as a concept and as something that they have imposed on indigenous peoples. But so you name it this little tongue-in-cheek, but how do you think that your movie like actually addresses or draws out the concept?
It doesn't really. I mean, it's kind of weird to say that. It
Yeah.
doesn't really address it. It doesn't explicitly say if the parents, I mean, if you know Native parents, they're gonna fall one way or the other on it. But in this film, you don't really see anybody actively sit there and say you should only date Native people or you should stay with your own kind. There's nothing like that because I've never really experienced that growing up.
Mhm.
But at the same time, I've always been told like stay with your own kind, be with Native people. And I didn't really address it in the film because I felt like the nature of digesting Native film is to look at the Native person in the film as a spokesperson for all Native people. So I didn't want to sit there and say, well, you're a quarter Native, so you're Native and you're not going to turn into a zombie. I don't want to get into anything like that because then, you'd be kind of mired in the logistics of who was immune and
Mhm.
who isn't. I really wanted to get the audience to reflect on it themselves. I mean, why is it a concept? How is it applied in our culture? And I think those are conversations that you're going to have within tribal families. I don't think it's anything that you can dictate with the film. So I kind of steer clear of the topic, to be honest. I used it as a very facile metaphor for retroactively playing back the events of colonialism. And I just thought it would be a clever idea instead of being susceptible to smallpox, we're immune to this particular disease. And it was a comment more on that.
Yeah.
And the idea that you're taking a settler invention, a settler structure, and you're weaponizing it against them. I think that's another thing that was kind of going on because you never really explain why Native people are immune in the film. It doesn't get addressed at all.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
just something that people just almost like race itself as an invention, as a social construct. Everybody just sees it as real, like Santa Claus or something like that. Everybody's just it's a mutually accepted lie, a mutually agreed upon lie. So it never really gets addressed. I mean, for all we know, there's like a tub of uranium or something underneath the reserve that's making them all immune. I mean, it could be anything. I never really addressed it because I felt like it was too complicated a conversation to have on film, and I didn't really want to get bogged down in the politics too much, which is weird to say when you think about the film, but I think the film does a good job of walking a fine line or codifying a lot of the politics to the point where if you didn't know about them already, then I don't think it would affect your viewing of the film.
Mhm.
You'd still look at it as a zombie film. You would still look at it as a piece of entertainment rather than this big uh, allegory on colonialism.
Well, it's the nice thing about speculative fiction though, right? Is you don't have to explain everything. You don't have to give the X, Y, and Z of, this is exactly the science behind it. You can just sort of skip to the thing, and in this case, you've got something, potentially a virus, could be something else, and it's affecting one group and not another. And I like the fact that you do that. You don't have to spend the whole film like trying to make up justifications for it, or having some scientist come in and explain it. You just do it. And then at the end, yeah, this is where I've had a lot of discussions with people. Is we're like, well, what is Charlie's baby going to be immune? What about the other baby that we saw that wasn't, or was it a zombie baby? Like, and you have these questions like, is Lysol, is his whole sort of like descent some sort of metaphor for like half-breed, anguish or whatever. Like it's, you're just sitting there just like going with it, thinking about, trying to think it through, if this really happened, how might it play out? And I think that's interesting, because then it creates this conversation with your audience that you're not even necessarily like there to witness, but it's going on around the film. Kind of becomes more than even what you've put out there necessarily. You often talk about your work as coming from like a res-based perspective, specifically nation-specific Mi'kmaq perspective and community perspective, because there's like obviously more than one Mi'kmaq community. So how do you sort of balance legibility? How do you make sure that you are sort of representing your community in a way that's not going to get you beat up when you go visit, and versus selling it to people who have never been to your community, maybe have never even heard of it? So how do you do that?
I don't really do it consciously. I just feel like when you've lived that experience, it's not something that you need to try to recall. I think it's lived experience. It's kind of like, uh, you're training to be a fighter and you drill a certain punch a million times, and when somebody throws a punch at you, you're just going to react at some point. So I think that's kind of what it's like. You get attuned to the world, and there's some trauma-based interaction there too, because when you exist as a Native person outside of your community, you feel hyper conscious of it. And for me, it didn't really sink in that I lived in a city until maybe when I moved back, actually, maybe 8 years ago, because I didn't really consider myself urban Indian. I didn't really fit in here. I still don't. I kind of hate it, actually. But I always feel at home when I'm at home.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's something to that too, because there's seemingly two camps: people that love reserves and people who do not. And I kind of fell right in the middle. And I think it's that objectivity and that lived experience that, it doesn't really need a forced application. You just do it because it's already ingrained in your personality.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that just comes through in the work, because you're basing these things on people. You're basing these characters on people in your life, and you're like, oh, what would this person do in a zombie apocalypse? And it would be like, well, he'd set up a snowblower on the bridge, obviously. So it's kind of stuff like that. It wasn't something that I consciously tried to do. As a matter of fact, it's almost a telltale sign when you have somebody out there talking about how much they represent their people. It's usually those ones that are kind of self-conscious about it, and am I doing this right? Like, can they see my clip-on braids? It's that kind of stuff. Whereas I think when you've grown up in that life, you don't really worry about whether or not you're doing it right,
Mm-hmm.
because there's no other way how to do it, to be honest.
Yeah. Do you think I mean, were there things that you wanted to put into the movie that you felt you would not make sense to a non-Indigenous audience that you took out? Was there anything that you really wanted and then you had a second thought about?
Not really. Anything that didn't make its way from the script to the screen was usually based on budget or time, or just trying to find the location, or there's a couple of instances where like the actors didn't want to do it. But other than that, it was more just practical stuff. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I can't think of anything. Well, if you want to count anything that white people wouldn't get, the fish coming back to life at the beginning.
Yeah.
That you're looking at that and be like, oh, what a cool way to start a zombie movie. Like Train to Busan had a deer coming back to life, but it was just deer coming back to life. It wasn't
Mm-hmm.
really like, oh, there was a certain deer tick in that part of Korea that kicked off some sort of zombie-like thing, and it was just deer dead on the road that came back to life. Whereas the fish in the Blood Quantum film at the beginning was more allusion to what was going on there in '81, the
Mm-hmm.
raid. kind of weaponizing the food source for Micmac people, and then you flash forward 40 years and the same shit's still going on. So it was more about that, and I don't think non-native people got that.
Mm-hmm.
And a few other things here and there, I think, went over their heads, and I think just some of the characterizations, like, and the other thing too, the one thing that I did deliberately do that I kind of didn't want to explain was Lysol's turning
Mm-hmm.
bad, and it wasn't really, it wasn't really that I didn't want to give him a reason. I just figured everybody would know what the reason was, why he would be angry or why he kind of flipped out.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't something that needed explaining. He was like a young native man in the 80s. What else do you need to know? Of course, it's great.
No, I think that's important. But so I just want to remark on the fact, like, so I'm asking you, is there anything that you didn't put in the movie because you were worried about a non-Indigenous audience? You're like, nah, da da da. That's remarkable. That's a big deal. The fact that you're able to get the resources. I know it's not all the resources you want, but get the resources to make something like this and have the say over what goes into it to that extent, where you're feeling comfortable about everything that you put in there and everything you didn't, is something that, like, I feel is new for Indigenous peoples. Like, it's something that's just happening, recently. And I keep kind of coming back to that. Everybody always asks, you're so critical about, portrayals of indigeneity in media. Who does a good job of it? But they're thinking, like non-natives, because they want to still be able to tell the stories, right? And I'm like, who's doing a good job of it? Or give Indigenous creators the money and the power, and they're going to come up with the stories that are going to be the most authentic and interesting. So just the fact that you're able to do that at this point, and then, into the future as well, hopefully you've got a bunch of things lined up and money's just going to fall from the sky. But it's kind of a big deal.
I have things planned. Not quite.
Just any philanthropists out there with billions of dollars? Just saying.
I think the reason I get away with that is I use genres, and genres have particular beats.
Mm-hmm.
Zombie genre, I didn't reinvent that wheel. You know how you kind of have to have like this white guide sometimes navigating you through the native film, the native world?
Yeah.
My white guide is Western cinema. Whereas there's so many familiar tropes to zombie movies or in Rhymes, a heist movie, that you can use those beats as the Western guide to native country. So whereas you're looking at a different perspective, but you're seeing it told you in a very familiar format. In this case, it would be the zombie film. Yeah. And we did it deliberately. Everybody was like, oh, there's zombie saturation. It's because zombie movies are like pornography, right? I mean, everybody's going to watch a little bit. Everybody's seeing wine. Mm-hmm. So there's always going to be that lowest common denominator there where you're trying to appeal with them. You're trying to appeal to them because they're the mass of the population, and ultimately what you're doing with the film is trying to get it to as many people as you can. So you're doing all this balancing between cultural representation, commercial viability, and entertainment. And that's what being a zombie movie kind of afforded me, was at least to a certain degree it's going to be entertaining. So let's just start injecting some politics and some spirituality in here.
Yeah.
And maybe nobody will notice. And it'll still be a cool zombie movie. So that's the reason that worked, because any res person living in, like, in this case it was the 80s, but in the time period that we grew up, or we're both 80s, 90s kids, I think you could take those people and put them in any fucking scenario. Like if it's a alien invasion scenario, wouldn't you want to see what like res guys do in that? Or, what a res girl would do during a zombie apocalypse, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So that was really the philosophy. You weren't really changing the story beats. You're just putting people that you were familiar in place of the the people that you typically see in these films. And by doing that, almost through osmosis, there's some sort of perspective shift there.
Right.
It's like the difference between One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the book, versus One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the movie, is that in the book, it was Chief telling the story. And if you're going to remake that movie, why not make it from his perspective? You can start doing that, right? You start doing that with everything. Do the Predator from Billy's perspective.
Oh
Just
my God, that would be so amazing.
like the native perspective films.
Yeah, that's so interesting though, how you're talking about, because that trope of using a white character to sort of guide you through the story is really enraging, honestly. So I like the idea of genre being the thing, because there, like you said, there's certain expectations, there's certain tropes for all of these genres that people know to expect, so they know where things are going, right? There's always room for twists and turns. But yeah, it gives you those pockets to put in the bits that are very specific to where you're coming from, that sort of appeal to Mi'kmaq and non-Mi'kmaq Indigenous peoples as well. Because there was so much in there that I was like, it's not often that you get to feel like an insider when you're watching sort of a big film, because one, it's either never filmed in a place that you've lived or visited. Or it involves people that are just so completely different from you that you're like, okay, it's all fantasy, including these people's weird lives, right? But this was really like, the characters were familiar, the rage that Lysol had, how like badass Joss was, but also like so kind and everything, like all of that was super familiar. And also what I think was really interesting is how much she used the language. I mean, like, it'd be awesome if the whole thing was in the language, but what did you run into there, and why did you decide to make sure that the language was represented?
Because you can put a cultural touchstone in the film without it seeming performative. Like, if they stopped and did a tobacco ceremony in the middle of all the chaos, it would feel, performative. It would feel like, all right, let's put in the native element for all the, white liberals up there. So for me, you can do that with Micmac or any native language, really. You could do it with any native language and not lose the kind of down to earth authenticity of the characters, which is kind of what I was going for. Mm-hmm. And it's not far fetched either. Like, that's how people would talk back then. They would switch from Micmac to English all the time, depending on who they were talking to, and would literally, if they knew there was somebody in the room that didn't speak it, if they wanted to have a conversation between just the two of them, that's what they would do. So there was stuff like from all over the place in the language. It wasn't just translating what they were saying. It was like how they were saying it, and like certain idioms. I mean, it was Micmac, and it was all in the name of not, I don't know, cheapening the culture, I guess, because you could still, like I said, you could say anything in Micmac and it doesn't reflect on the culture per se because it's characters saying the words. Anyway, it's kind of something that I've always done in all my films. My mom's a language teacher, and my niece is a language teacher, and it's big in our family. So it feels like it's one of the things you're supposed to be doing as an artist, as a native artist, and that's perpetuate your culture. Mm-hmm. But I want to do it in a way that wasn't ceremonial, like it wasn't sacred. It was just part of everyday interaction, because that's really what language should be. That's what the culture should be. It should be everyday interaction, not ceremony every July for the powwow. It should be like everyday part of your life. And back in the 80s, it was like people really predominantly spoke Mi'kmaq. You even see it in the film Alanis's Incident at Restigouche. Mm-hmm. There's people there that just speak Mi'kmaq.
Yeah. No, that's a good point, is making it, because that's the thing, is we do it to ourselves too. Sometimes language is ceremony, right? Particularly people who don't have much of the language, it becomes ever sacred. It's like this thing that you only use, like this. We often get told, because I teach Nekiawewan, and we get told sometimes, oh, there's no swears in our language. Like, What? There's plenty of things. There's plenty of ways to call people ugly things in every language. There are definitely swears in our language. And speaking the way that people do every day is not somehow demeaning the language or anything. I think bringing it back to health means using it in every way that all languages are used. It's going to be scatological sometimes, it's going to be sacred sometimes, it's going to be, boring. But if it's pervasive, that's health, right? Um, so what do you think about some of the critiques that you've heard about the film? So I'm thinking about, particularly, I know that there's been some folks who are not happy with how far you went with the portrayal of some of the women, for example, not a big enough role. Or I don't know, I read James as non-binary, so I kind of include James in there as well. How do you feel about that? Do you think that,
Yeah,
like,
it was actually written for a guy, and I'm like, why can't it be a girl? There's nothing here that says it can't be a girl. And at
mm,
this point, I was really conscious of there's a lot of dudes in this movie, so maybe we should cast a girl.
yeah.
Um, but it wasn't really for me. It wasn't like let's exclude the women. It was more like let's include men. Let's do a story about men. And I wrote it before I was a dad, but I rewrote it and crystallized the story while I was having my first son, or
Mhm.
my only son, my only child. And I didn't have a dad in my life, and I grew up in foster care, so I was really, really scared about it. And that's really what the film is about. It was just kind of this this phobia of mine of being a bad. That's really the theme of the film,
Mm,
more so than actual zombies or as much as colonialism. At least it's this idea that Native men have lost their ways being fathers. It's like they don't know how to do it anymore. I mean, that was kind of part of the exploration there.
mhm,
And you kind of had two generations of dads and one to soon be father just trying to figure it out. And to me, the apocalypse stuff, zombie apocalypse, was almost incidental. It was just
mhm.
like, it could have been during anything, like a boil of water advisory or something. Like,
Right.
it's the whole thing's a metaphor for the raid, so it really could take the place of any siege, and it was just more about why these parents couldn't speak to their children, particularly men. And I just didn't have any. I don't know how to really say it. I just didn't have any faith in myself as a dad. So that's
Mhm.
what was really happening there.
Yeah.
And I wanted to tell that story. It wasn't really like I wanted to exclude anybody. It was, I just did Rise for Young Ghouls, and it was the exact opposite. It was like I wanted to tell the story of this young girl and
Mhm.
focus specifically on her. It was kind of the same focus, but for the other end, it was like, how do these young men redeem themselves after experiencing all this trauma? I mean, that's kind
Mhm.
of what it was about.
Right.
And you see it failed for Lysol, it failed for Trailer. Um, the grandfather kind of chose not to fight anymore, and it was just the young man left to his own devices and the
Mhm.
lessons that those three failed dads left them.
Right.
So I mean, if there's any ambiguity at the end of the film, I mean that's a part of it. It's not only is the baby a zombie, is it is this kid
What kind of
capable of
parent is he
taking
gonna be?
care of this
Yeah.
kid capable of taking care of this child? And
Right,
it
right.
kind of has the impression, not really. If his mom wasn't there, not really. You'd be a little worried about him. But
Mhm.
seeing the mom holding the kid, you kind of have a glimmer of hope there, because
Mhm.
it's like, well, she made it this far, so there's got to be something about it. There's got to be something about her approach that makes her a survivor.
Right.
So it definitely wasn't. It wasn't. It wasn't Josh's story. It wasn't James' story. They do have stories though, because we're doing. I just started doing the outline for a TV show, and it's going to be more focused on them.
Yeah.
Because, you know, the thing about it was just kind of like, all right, Joss and James are two most prominent women in there, most prominent Native women.
Yeah.
And Joss in particular, you just get the impression that she's going to be okay. Like she's going to be just steady. And that, you know, you don't need to with Joss because it's like she's going to be here bandaging people up at the beginning of the movie and she's going to be there at the end doing the same thing. So it was just, I don't think it would be remiss to say that is a great story. Like you asked me earlier if there's anything that I had written that I didn't get on screen that bugged me.
Mm-hmm.
Her escape from the hospital.
Okay,
like,
yeah.
How she chopped her way out of the hospital with that fire axe.
Yes, that would have been so. I know that was one thing. That was one thing that I really wish I could have seen. And I get, you know, you got these constraints, right? And her showing up that way, you knowing that she chopped her way out, like that's, you know, that's great already. But yeah, I just wanted a scene, just her, just like slow kills. It would have been awesome. But if you get to do this
all
series,
that stuff, it was kind of like it didn't make it into the film because of budgets shooting.
Yeah.
So it was, you know, a question of who can you focus on and who would make a more coherent story. And that's, it was really a story about fathers. Again, it could have been, like I said, I just had my child. So that was on my mind and was like, oh my God, this is obviously about fathers now.
Yeah.
It felt like it all gelled together and nobody really criticizes Native men constructively or artistically. It's just kind of like, oh, Native men are trash. And it's like, well, maybe, but there's a lot of really good justifiable reasons how we got there. It wasn't just like we woke up one day and decided to be awful.
Yeah.
So I will explore that a little bit and do it in a way that was, you know, a bit of a comment on masculinity in and of itself, not just fatherhood. Because every man in there, they're such archetypes. It can almost be like they can almost start a village people band with all their, you know, you got the biker and Lysol, you got the cop, you got the construction worker. I mean, you got the guy with the samurai sword, the warrior. I mean, it's all they're all archetypical men, and they're all kind of broken down to expose what makes them human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So basing this in 1981, like you've talked a lot about how it's you know, it's sort of like an allegory for the raids. So why that though? I mean, like, do you feel, you know, because like going back in time to make, you know, a zombie film sort of does a little something with our suspension of disbelief, right? It's an alternative history now. Okay. So why did you want to make it based on that? Like I know it affected you personally, but what did you feel this movie was going to say to everybody else about those raids or about what's going on right now in Mi'kma'ki?
Well, I think that it's cyclical or that it's never stopped. The idea that you can take any story about colonial capitalism, I mean, to me, they're the same thing, at any given time and have it be so prescient. I mean, that's really the story there. It wasn't like I predicted it. It was just, it predicted itself. It's like the Earth's cycle around the moon, you know what I mean? Or vice versa. It's just something you could predict. And for me, it was more a comment on this happened in the 80s, and then you kind of had an allusion to it happening in the 90s. And then, you know, you have all these other conflicts that throw up blockades that typically happen over environmentalism or the use of resources on reserves. Mm-hmm. So it just seemed like a good theme, or a good theme. Blockades is a good theme because there's going to be another one at some point in the near future. And it just seemed like, for me, that was almost a political awakening in Canada. When that happened in 81, it became a national news story, and it set the trend for what you were going to see afterwards with all these, Oka crisis happened, and then the fishy crisis in Gescabegia. I mean, it's something you could count on. So by setting it in between, sort of, it's kind of like, well, it's still happening, but it's happened all this time, and colonialism is really just capitalism, and it's really this system that hasn't changed. It's about mass consumerism, and it's about kind of ignoring that your resources have a finite best before date.
Yeah. The idea that exponential growth is possible and also has to exist for capitalism to continue, right? Like it doesn't make any sense. The math doesn't add up, right?
Well, that's it. I mean, it's kind of like, well, that's it. I mean, it's a zombie that doesn't stop eating until it's gone.
What I think is interesting about sort of, so you said it after the raids, but what a lot of people don't know is that then your community set up its own fishery. Like after that it was sort of the catalyst for a self-governing fishery. And then now we're seeing Mi'kmaq have like bought like half of Clearwater. So you've got, I think the responses to these events, the way that in particular Mi'kmaq communities have been able to sort of like, they're like, okay, fine. You guys want to get all violent. You want to burn stuff down. You want to protest. You want it all because we've got this tiny little sliver of it. And you guys are the ones who are like, killing off everything. Fine. We'll play your game, but we're going to do it better. And we're going to do it according to our own ways of doing things. Right. So I think that like the fact that Indigenous communities have been able to do that over and over again is, one, super clever. It's a subversion of sort of the expectation that moderate livelihood or subsistence hunting, where Indigenous peoples are only allowed to like just barely survive, above starvation levels, but you're never supposed to be able to like get ahead, because then you're not really Indigenous anymore. I like the fact that this sort of turns it on the head and it says, okay, well, we'll play your game, but the rules are ours. So I'd like to see how that could be used as like an extension of the film. Like, at the end, you're wondering what's going to happen. Well, how does the community come together after that? What is, because I believe that it can, right? They're sort of like had this huge conflict and disagreement about how to do it. But, in the end, what would Listuguj do? How would it come together? How would it repair? How would it like continue to exist? Obviously you don't answer that in the film, but it's an interesting thing to think about within the context of what that community has actually done in the face of like really intense colonial violence. So it's
the film continues. I mean, it doesn't end with the the story continues. The film ends where the baby is born, but it picks up like exactly in the same space, and then I move on to another tried and tested colonial trope, and that's snatching babies from native moms. So that's what the story continues on. They try to take the baby to make a blood serum for the zombie apocalypse.
Of
course. Now the surviving government is snatching all the native babies to see if they can make a blood serum. That was the idea for the sequel, which I guess might make it into the television show. Who knows?
Yeah.
But that was really that was a big story, man. It wasn't just what you saw on screen. That was really probably only a little under half of what I actually wrote for that story. Everybody keeps talking about it as being too short of a film, or there wasn't enough time with the characters, and that's why, because it was meant to be a much bigger story. And when it became obvious that we weren't going to get that money, it was like, all right, what you kind of pick and choose what you put on screen at that point.
Yeah, for sure. It's probably time to answer some questions from the audience.
Thank you so much for your insightful conversation. We have some great questions from the audience. And if you, for those who are still here, if you do have further questions for Jeff and Chelsea, keep adding them to the Q&A and we'll try and get through as many as we can. So Jennifer says, amazing film. I really enjoyed it, which I agree with. Well put, Jennifer. I thought that the animated sequences were really cool, and I plan to go back and watch them again. And for those who aren't familiar with the rest of Jeff's work, you also used animation and rhymes for Young Ghouls quite extensively. Could you talk a little bit about these sequences, why you decided to include them, and how you see them illuminating the film's context and narrative?
Well, they don't just elevate what's being seen on screen. I think it adds a kind of aesthetic to it, and it makes it a bit more lyrical. Like there is another layer there that's meant to be, unpacked and interpreted. Because if you look at where they come in, one, their act breaks essentially. Like you see one, the first one you see is right after the fishing scene, and I think it was meant initially to be a kind of testimonial to the pollution of the earth and the pollution of mankind because of the pollution of the earth. And there was some real specific stuff there because if you look at it, it's actually the same mill that you see in the opening that's behind her. And there's a couple of other little details. It was meant to replace something that happens that's even creepier at the beginning of the film, that I wanted it to have this overall theme of motherhood and fatherhood and parenthood. So I needed to recall that image of pregnant mother again. So we just added that on there. And I think for the second one, it happens right after Lysol gets his dick bit off. And for that, we wanted to do kind of the same thing. We wanted to show an actual physical manifestation of Alan going to Lysol. So it goes from him just kind of, just being bit and trying to control himself to it exploding in pyres. And if you look at the things that burn are actually, they're funeral pyres. You can still see the limbs and stuff hanging out. It's actually a reference to a Brzezinski painting from that his work is always it's always kind of been Holocaust themed, although he never really comes out and says it. You see it in his work. So there was a little bit of that in there too, of Lysol really doing a villain turn and adding some of the aesthetic that I wanted in the film back into the animation sequence. And the third one was just to kind of leave it ambiguous for the old man as to whether or not he lived or died.
Yeah, I
Because
like that.
like it looks like he dies at the end, but you see him holding a head up like he did earlier in the film, and it's an allusion to a line out of Incident at Wrestlers, where there's an old man in there that says, I got my axe and I made a line on the ground and I dared them to cross it. So those were really the three animation pieces in a nutshell.
Who did those?
Daniel Geist
What's
at
that?
ED Films. Daniel Geist at ED Films.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he's a genius. he was such a pleasure to work with.
Was
Yeah,
he the same animator who worked on Rhymes?
No, he did work on the film though. That guy did the. He ended up redoing the Fishman signs from Rhymes for Blood Quantum again because we lost it. I don't know what happened with it.
Thanks.
Great.
Yeah, I like to think that the grandfather lived. That's our big one. We loved him so much. Oh my God.
He did. I'll tell you right now, he did live.
Yes, he's such a badass.
But like he's that's one of the things that ends up being a continuation of the story. James, Devery's character, and him survive on the reserve depending on each other. Because that's what happens when you pick up his story. You see James come and rescue him and carry him off, and they start surviving, avoiding the zombies, the overrun zombies, and then the army guys show up looking for more native babies, and then those two end up rescuing the great granddaughter of the Gisigu character. Anyway, there you go. I just picture the sequel.
It was one of the great moments in the film when you open the barn doors in that one sort of warehouse and he's just standing there in front of a heap of dead Zeds. Kelly asks if you can talk a little bit about your casting process, maybe where you found your actors, whether you'd worked with them before on other projects, and maybe a little bit what it was like to work with them on a film where a good portion of them get blades put in them.
I cast for type, which is to say I try to see as much of the actual character in the person that I'm looking at to play the role as I can. And that's how we ended up casting Devery in Rhymes. It was just looking at her, I was like, yeah, that's her. Like, it doesn't really matter how she, like, I just prayed she could act. And then we saw her rehearsal and her audition, and we were impressed enough to cast her. And Gisigu, like the old man, we literally pulled him out of a powwow. Like, he was on the powwow circuit selling his baskets, and he's like an MMA trainer on the side. So it wasn't a matter of self-confidence. It was like, when you get somebody who's not experienced, the thing you worry about the most isn't like, besides being comfortable on camera, is can they handle the hours? Because it can be a lot of hours, and for an actor, a lot of those hours could just be you sitting on your ass waiting for the next shot to be set up. And we didn't have trailers, man. we had lawn chairs. You guys can go, you can go chill out on the lawn chair. You can have like some tea from Kraft, but you have no trailers here, so you're not going to be comfortable. So it was more of that. And for this particular picture, it was like you didn't have to start off with, because there isn't a lot of actors out there that are native. And once you find them, you need to find them experienced enough to know whether or not they can carry a whole film. And that's really why we cast Michael, was because I wanted somebody that was going to show up and not give me any of the days that we were going to be filming, because that's easily the biggest, stressor, and that could suck the life out of you. And the last person we cast was actually Elmaya for Joss, because there was nobody there. I mean, it's like there's a ton of young actresses, young native actresses, but when you start looking for native elders or middle-aged Indians, those are kind of harder to come by, because there's not that many people that survived that long into the business. And Elmaya, we were lucky. It was more because Michael looks young enough to be her partner. And it was like I was a little hesitant, because she is young. I think she's in her 20s. So she was, I didn't want to do the thing where we cast a 50-year-old dude and he's like trying to woo a 19-year-old girl. I didn't want to do that. But the more I thought about it, I was like, that's kind of what relationships are like. So fuck it, let's just cast Maya. And she was the best person for the job, because everybody else was, we read a lot of people, but she was easily the best person for the job. And it was really just that. It was just kind of, making obvious choices played off of, you don't have that many choices. So it's like you can cast this person or this person, but that's it, because these are the only two people that audition, because these are the only fucking 40-year-old native actors up there anymore. So a lot of it's that you're kind of having your cast dictated to you by availability, by whether or not they exist, because there was no old man, there was no Gisigu. Like, the way he was written on the page, he was like, you would have to hatch him in a vat somewhere. But along came Stonehorse, like literally reading on the page the same way the character does. And at that point, you were just praying to God that he can run his lines. Be yourself, run your lines, and that's it. We'll survive this. And he surprised everybody, because he didn't just do that. He got into it, and then he started getting into the acting, and he started like emoting by the end of it. So I get lucky a lot, and in this case, really lucky, because we didn't have any audition or any rehearsal time. We just kind of, like, Elmaya and Michael showed up, and the day after we were shooting together. It's like gonzo porn. It's just, hey, you guys just meet. Let's start working together. And that was it. There was no rehearsals. We did stunt rehearsals. We did fight rehearsals. I don't remember doing any acting rehearsals. Just know your lines, and I'll see you tomorrow.
You're understating it a bit, because you take for granted that you're going to cast native actors, right? That's not an industry standard at all.
No,
You
it
know,
is.
so like the fact that you're like, okay, you know, here's my pool. Again, like it's kind of, you know, it's kind of a big deal. The fact how many non-natives end up taking those roles because there isn't the pool, right? But when you have people who are the content creators who are insisting on that, like that makes more space. It gives, you know, more native people, particularly youths, are going to go into acting now because they're like, well, there are directors out there who are going to make a point of casting us. You know, that's a big deal.
It's the weird thing about it too is that you're always going to run into a fake Indian or somebody that you cannot verify, and we did on this film too. And then it was like the casting people were like, "Why do you have such high standards?" They're not high standards.
That bar is on the ground. That bar is on the ground. High standards? What? Like?
No, not you have high standards. The production has high standards.
Yeah.
Standards. They're not low or high. They're just standards. It's like if I wanted to cast a human being, I would expect that person to be a human being. I wouldn't expect you to start parading dogs in here. So it was like, I want an Indian. Find me an Indian. Don't find me like a Puerto Rican or a half Mexican or like somebody who's black saying they're native. I mean, it's like just find a native actor. They're out there.
Well put. I have a question here from Kendall Lovely that I actually think might also be something that you can jump in on, Chelsea, given your work on Métis in Space. So she writes that, or they write, I'm sorry, sci-fi channel television. There's a sci-fi channel television show called Z Nation that has some episodes focused on depicting native sovereign societies in a zombie apocalypse setting. And this is also some form of this is a pretty conventional trope in a lot of sci-fi and spec fic TV and film. I was wondering if you were at all familiar with this show or any others, and whether it influenced the way you approach the film, or were you thinking perhaps about how to make a different version or approach to this kind of trope that, as Chelsea points out in a lot of her work on Métis in Space, is quite common in a lot of sci-fi cinema.
The zombie trope?
Or the trope of sort of like a sovereign native or quasi-native society in the midst of a kind of apocalypse or...
At all. No, I didn't think of that at all. I mean, this is, again, one of those things where when you grow up in the life, you don't really think about it. It just, it's a part of, you know, what it is you're doing. It's not by design that I was thinking like, all right, we're going to create a sovereign post-apocalyptic society. It was just, you live within the confines, especially in the 80s, you live within the confines of your reserve. You don't go into town, you don't go off reserve. So when this thing happens, it's really simple to maintain those borders because you know exactly where they are and you know exactly how to keep people in and out of them. So that's kind of really what I was doing. I haven't seen Z Nation, and I haven't seen when I cast Michael, I had no idea it was in The Walking Dead. If I did, there's a real good chance I wouldn't have cast him because it was just to avoid that. I wouldn't have wanted to do like another, oh, there's Michael Grey Eyes killing zombies again. I didn't think of like I tried to watch Z Nation. I don't think I got that into it. So I wasn't really paying attention to what anybody was doing. When I was absorbing information for the zombie stuff, I was looking at movies more for aesthetic kills, and I was looking towards books more for plot points or story outlines or beats like that. Like I find zombie films to be kind of stagnant. Zombie literature is still pretty, you know, pretty amazing and inventive. And there's all kinds of things you can do there's all kinds of things that have been done in post-apocalyptic zombie literature that's a lot more interesting than what's going on in cinemas, more because of budgets, if anything. But yeah, that's kind of where I was coming from. It wasn't, you know, that's the thing, man. When you're native, you don't think about being native. You just are. And then everybody kind of points it out to you afterwards in Q&As like this. And you're like, yeah, I guess it is kind of native. I never thought of it like that.
Yeah, I remember the one episode that we did watch from Z Nation was we were nowhere near the Grand Canyon. And the tension there was that they didn't want to let people in. You know, there was the tsunami, there were so many zombies, right? They called it a like tsunami. And all these people were trapped and they wanted refuge in the native community. And a bunch of them were like, no. But of course, somebody goes and takes them on some peyote trip because that's what we always do, right? We just don't know you from Adam, but you just come meet us and we're gonna give you some sort of vision quest. And man, yeah. So glad you didn't see it. It was terrible.
No, my wife is Navajo, and she's been trying to get me to do peyote for like the past 6 years.
See, if you were a white guy, you would have done it already. You would have done it like within 2 seconds of meeting her, and then you would have been the most Indian
like,
Indian ever.
You know, my mind doesn't need psychotropes. It doesn't need the help, man. Like if you have Valium or anything like that, while you guys are doing peyote, we'll probably level off together. But like, I don't need peyote.
Oh my God, thinking about any creativity coming out of you fueled by peyote is scary. given your films already.
I'm not opposed to seeing that film somewhere down the road, but that's for another Zoom call. Just as we wrap up here, I have one final question from Robert Burrows. He asks, I know for me it was incredible to see Campbellton in the area shown on a feature film. I'm curious what, if any, the response from the community on either side of the bridge was to the film and the production, and seeing their region portrayed in a pretty special production. For instance, the aesthetic of the river is something else.
I think everybody was pretty happy with it. It's not like I went and asked anybody, but I think everybody liked what they saw. Exactly what you said. The area was presented well, and I think the story is too ridiculous for anybody to take any personal umbrage with it. Although, you know what, man, I I say that, but you get the impression when reading some criticisms that that's exactly what happened. Like it was, oh, just another woke zombie movie, or you know, just another hate the whites movie, and it's neither of those things. And I think people from the region understand that because they're from the region. And I think the tension that does exist there, I think it's just a part of life to a certain extent. And it's, again, one of these things when you're experiencing it, it's not that prominent, if that makes any sense. It's stuff that, you know, it's kind of like when the Micmac and the Nova Scotia fishers became international news. It was news to everybody outside that community, but if you lived there, you knew the tension existed. So it wasn't that big of a deal. But all that to say, I think the movie speaks for itself aesthetically. I think the church, the bridge, the shoreline, I think all that stuff was presented with as much love as my eye and my budget could muster. So it wasn't like we set out to malign the community or anything. I mean, in terms of how it's projected, I mean, it's like a made up community. We went out of our way to show the names of the community as being made up, and I think it's a smart thing to do because you can appreciate the film for what it is, while at the same time appreciate that it's filmed in your community, even though it's all made up. And yeah, I mean, it's weird that nobody shot down there before because of the bridge and the way the sun is. It actually goes down behind the bridge, so you can always shoot into it, and it gives you these great silhouettes. Like that's exactly what we were doing. And there's this weird effect that comes off the river where in the morning, you actually see it in the film again too, everything is covered in haze and you can't really see anything. Like when you see the last stand and all that fog on the water, I mean, that wasn't put there in post, it was there. It looked like that day. It looked like a post-apocalyptic landscape. Everything was gray. I don't know why. All the lights were shut off. Like we barely had to do anything to those shots to make them look like they were in, like we could have pulled them out of Children of Men.
With that, again, thank you, Chelsea. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Mia. And I hope everybody has a wonderful night.
Bye.
Bye, guys.